All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the final presentation of the Armchair Traveler series. We kicked this thing off back in January, and it's been fantastic all the way up to this point. So I'm glad we can end tonight on a high note. I am Brandon Wilkes, the Education Coordinator at the Haines Public Library. I want to say a big, huge, colossal thank you to Cindy Buxton, Russ White, for putting this whole thing together, just like they put the last one together. A whole lot of legwork was done to find the presenters and to get everything lined up, and we had cancellations and reschedulings and everything else like that, and she really kind of made this all come together. And somehow I'll steal credit for some of this, but I really thanks a lot, Cindy. This would not have happened without you, and it's been a fantastic season. Just for everybody coming in right now, you are muted. Just go ahead and keep that mute on until the end. We ask that you keep all your questions until the end of the presentations. If one pops up and you just don't want to have to wait to the end, you can go ahead and put it in the chat so that Caroline can address it at the end, or if she wants to stop and address it in the middle of it, that's completely up to her. If anyone has any ideas for presentations they'd like to do now in the future, they'd like to be part of a future Armchair Traveler series, call the library, 766-6420. You can email me, education@haineslibrary.org. I'm around. I will answer sooner or later. I think that's it for the admin thing. So thank you again, Cindy Buxton. I will kick it over to you and hope everyone else enjoys the presentation. And if you know someone who wanted to be here and missed it, this will be on the Haines Library website and on our YouTube channel, probably by tomorrow. And if you missed any of the other presentations, they're already uploaded. Go check them out. They've all been great. So don't miss out. All right, without further ado, enough from me and on to you, Cindy Buxton. Go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Brandon, and I should thank Brandon for doing this. And he has pretty long days at work, and now he does this in the evenings, and he makes it very easy to do all this. Before I introduce Carolyn, I'd like to say this is the last talk for this year. We'll probably do it again next year. So if any of you have some adventures, they can be far away or nearby. And if you'd like to give a talk, just let me know. We can help you through all the technical aspects, so don't be intimidated. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Carolyn. Carolyn von Hemert is an author, adventurer, wildlife biologist, and her book, The Sun is a Compass, which we have at the library, and I highly recommend it, was the winner of the Banff Mountain Book Award for Adventure Travel and cited as one of the best outdoor books of 2019 by Outside, Bustle, and Forbes. Her journeys, both personal and professional, have taken her from the pack ice of the Arctic Ocean to the swamps of the Okavango Delta. Along the way, she's been outsmarted by Cheeto-eating crows, stalked by predatory bears, charged by elephants, and humbled by 10-gram chickadees that shiver through the winter nights. Her writing has been featured in the New York Times, Audubon, Outside, and the Washington Post, and more. With her husband and 2 young sons, she divides her time between a cozy home in downtown Anchorage and a remote off-grid cabin near Haines over at Glacier Point. She holds a PhD in wildlife biology and an MA in creative writing. I would highly recommend reading her book. It's not only is it worth it for just learning about the adventure, but she is a very good author. I like reading adventure stories, and they're not all well written. And I found this one to have just the right amount of detail about the adventure and the right amount of sharing of her internal thoughts and insights and processing of what she saw. And so it's one of the best books of this type that I've read before. And like I said, we have it at the library. Okay, I'll hand it over to Carolyn.
Thanks so much, Cindy. I don't know if folks can see, I'm having a little bit of a screen freeze here where I just see the recording note. Can you all see that, or do you just see the slide?
I just see the slide.
Okay. Well, we'll see if it lets me advance. Otherwise, I'm going to have Brandon stop the share because I don't seem to have control on my screen at the moment. But so let's see. Are you on the Big Brooks Range backdrop right now? Okay, so it skipped ahead a couple, but that's fine. We'll just jump right in. So as Cindy mentioned, I am a biologist in my day job. I study wildlife health in the Arctic and a variety of different birds. And when I get the chance, I get to adventure, sometimes with my kids and sometimes without. And I love to write, and this book was kind of my first real endeavor into writing in a more professional manner. So it's been definitely a journey in its own right. I'll talk about it a little bit. So the book I'll be reading from is The Sun as a Compass, which you might have seen in the previous slide that kind of advanced on its own will. But I'm going to just get us kind of into the spirit of the trip, which I'll talk about for the first half of the presentation, and read a little excerpt from the prologue of the book to give you a sense of what it's about and hopefully launch you into the action. I'm standing on the bank of the swift Chandalar River in the Brooks Range of northern Alaska, trying to gather the courage to swim across. My husband, Pat, is by my side. We're alone as we have been for most of the past 5 months. The sky is a depthless sort of overcast, no definition in the clouds, no glimmer of sunshine. The temperature hovers just above freezing, and the air is damp after a night of rain. I grip the straps of my pack, my fingers raw from the chill, and lean against Pat as we look down at the river that flows in a wide channel 60 feet below us. The only sound is a steady rush of moving water. I push away the voice in my head that echoes a single question. What are we doing? Over the last 139 days, we have traversed nearly 3,000 miles, most recently through places so lightly traveled our topographic maps have little to say about them. Only the highest peaks are labeled, and then solely by elevation. The Brooks Range is the northernmost major mountain range on Earth and has retained its integrity in ways that few places have. Many of the creeks and valleys are nameless, their curves and riffles left unexplored. There are no soft edges here, no boardwalks or trails or park rangers. It's wild, empty, and gritty. We're here because we're attempting to travel entirely under our own power from the Pacific Northwest to a remote corner of the Alaskan Arctic. We're here because we need wilderness, like we need water or air, like we need each other. For me, this trip is also a journey back to trees and birdsong, to lichen and hoofprints. Before leaving, I had lost my way on the path that carried me from biology to natural wonder. I had forgotten what it meant, not only in my mind, but in my heart, to be a scientist. We have 1,000 miles ahead of us, but for now, all that matters is this river. On the map, it looked harmless, squiggly and blue. As I stare down at it now, it's the color of mud. From our elevated vantage, the water's opaque surface appears smooth, but when Pat throws a spruce bough from the bank, it bobs in the small waves, spins once, then vanishes quickly downriver. In the first months of our journey, the destination was so distant that it seemed almost peripheral. Kotzebue, a small village on the shores of the Chukchi Sea, a place on the map as arbitrary as any other. We were consumed by each day, distracted by aching muscles and wails and the simple act of moving, always moving. But the stakes quietly grew, shape-shifting from a tally of miles into something much more. Only now am I beginning to see this trip for what it is, a celebration and a letting go of youth, a reawakening of the biologist in me, a reckoning between us and the land, something we must see through to the end. And so that crossing this river has become necessary in the way that it's necessary to kiss a lover before leaving, to pause and look up when the moon is rising. Our bodies know what is essential and what is not. Uh-oh. So this is not letting me advance slides. So I don't know if, Brandon, you could control the share and jump me out of it, and then I'll try again. I think it's because the recording notice came up and it's not letting me get out of that. Sorry for the interruption.
One moment.
Okay. Okay. So this is the, sorry, the a little bit of the tension was dispelled there, but this is the river that we ended up swimming across. And it turned out to be a lot bigger and a lot colder, and in the end, a lot scarier than either of us had anticipated. But it was a moment in the trip where the sort of stakes of what we were doing really became evident, and also the reward. So I won't get into all the details, because if you are interested to read about it more, it's in the book. But on the other side of the river, when we landed, we found a family of gray-headed chickadees. And to my knowledge, it may have been the very last sighting of gray-headed chickadees with young anyhow in this region of Alaska since that time. And as a wildlife biologist, that I've studied chickadees for a lot of my career, it was a pretty special thing to find. So one of those moments, like probably a lot of you have experienced in the natural world, where it kind of delivers exactly what you need when you need it. So just to kind of give you a big picture view for those of you who maybe haven't seen me present before or aren't familiar with this route, it took us about 6 months to cover roughly 4,000 miles. So we started down in Bellingham and came up the Inside Passage. And like Alan, for those of you who were on at the beginning of the call, mentioned, we washed up on many different beaches along the way, sometimes with welcoming folks who took us in or fed us or helped us get dry and warm. We started in the middle of March, so it was a pretty stormy time of year. And we ended up coming up and landing at Glacier Point at our place there. It was I think the first week of May, so still pretty early in the season by those standards. And then we went up and over the mountains, and I'll show you some photos as we go along. Went up and over the mountains to get into the interior of the Yukon, into the headwaters of the Yukon River, and paddled that all the way to Dawson, where we left the canoe that we had rented behind and started traveling by foot and pack raft up and through the Tombstone Park, Tombstone Mountains, into the Wind River, the Peel River, and then ultimately into the Mackenzie River up to the Arctic coast, and traveled west along the Arctic coast to Kaktovik and kind of the gateway to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and went directly south and then traversed more or less the crest of the Brooks Range all the way to the Noatak River, which we then followed to Kotzebue. So it was all human powered, moving quite a few miles every day by various means of transportation. So we tried our best to kind of match the mode of transportation to the landscape. So we took rowboats up the Inside Passage. These were actually boats that Pat had built, and we were brand new to rowing, not by design, but because when we set out, we kind of knew that we wanted to, for one, have the stability of a rowboat as opposed to a kayak, and also to be moving our legs. So we're going to be transitioning from water to snow and then a lot of hiking. And the thought of kind of sitting for 6 or 7 weeks in a kayak and letting our legs atrophy wasn't very appealing. But as many best intentions go, the boats were not built until shortly before we left. And so our very first day on the water was just a day before we set out from Bellingham in a hailstorm, hoping for the best as we headed north. We did a lot of travel by pack raft. So probably many of you are familiar with these cool little inflatable boats that you can roll up and put on your back or in your backpack while traveling. And it kind of allows you to be amphibious on the landscape. We skied up and over the coast mountains, just across Lynn Canal, kind of to the shoulder below Mount St. Clair, and then into Canada's interior. And then we put a lot of miles in just by hiking. So a lot of, went through several pairs of shoes, pounded out a lot of miles on various terrain. And we did a couple of sections by canoe, both a section of the Yukon River and the Noatak River. But as we designed the trip or dreamt up the trip, I guess we tried to find a balance between the most more or less efficient means of transport, but also minimizing the logistics of getting boats and equipment and various things to all these different locations. So we relied on the Postal Service for resupplies almost exclusively, and would mail ourselves boxes of food in advance, or my dad was kind of our main shipper throughout the trip. And so we were able to do it with relatively minimal logistics, even though we were covering a large area in a variety of different modes of transportation. So here we are coming up the Inside Passage. I think this might have been actually in Lynn Canal, and did not feel like a very spring-like day. We did discover that dishwashing gloves are pretty ideal for those kinds of conditions. I'm sure some of you have your own stories of what works best in stormy southeast and the off season. And then we arrived to our cabin, which is, as Cindy mentioned, at Glacier Point. And this is essentially the view from kind of our front yard. And there's the pass below Sinclair, and that's where we were headed. So we left our rowboats behind, had to kind of suck up the fact that it was time to leave the coffee and the warm cabin behind and head out when we had a weather window. And here we are coming up and over. And although it was already May, and so ideally would have been more of a spring snowpack. It turned out that because all of the sort of stormy weather and rain we'd been having down low translated into several new feet of snow up in the mountains. And of course, that doesn't always bode well for good stability. And so we came up the pass without incident, but as it was getting warmer and kind of moister, we recognized pretty quickly that it wasn't going to be an option to take the route that we'd intended. So we ended up having to come off of one glacier and back onto another to find our way. And one of the things that I really noticed when we were transitioning from the ocean to the mountains was just the lack of kind of good company of whales and birds and sea lions and seals. There was just so much activity down on the coast, as you all know. And then coming up into the snow and ice, it suddenly felt like this really incredibly barren landscape. But there was one moment in particular for me that really stood out as a biologist and as a traveler. And I'm going to read a little section from that experience. So we're shuffling along. This is kind of near the Canadian border. And this was probably the nicest day that we had up there in general. It was pretty socked in and pretty darn stormy. Gradually, the sky opens just enough to reveal a glacial lake shimmering in the mist to our left. Ice shines through the clear water. Oops. And a rock is perched near its edge. As I get closer, the rock turns its head and is no longer the color of stone. What was gray from a distance has become white. I blink and reach for my binoculars. Through glass, I see a shocking scene. At nearly 5,000 feet on a broad ice field, a trumpeter swan is taking a bath. A world away from the lowland ponds and lakes where it breeds, far from the plants it must eat to power its flight, the bird appears perfectly at home. It looks over at us, stretches its long neck toward the sky, then continues its ablutions. The surprise sighting reminds me to look up more frequently, and soon I realize that we have joined a procession of other travelers. First, I notice a small flock of swallows as they fight against the fierce headwind. The birds toggle back and forth to switch back into the gusts. When the clouds lift above the mountaintops, I see a hawk catch a thermal and rise into the gray sky. Soon other migrants pass. Shorebirds call overhead. A flock of geese flies high above us. Suddenly, this place feels much less deserted. It occurs to me then that our route is a logical flyway for birds heading inland from the Pacific coast. It's no accident that we're all following this path of least resistance. A low point in an otherwise jagged range, a toothy gap in the barricade of the coast mountains. From Lynn Canal, birds funnel up the Katsahine River and over the mountains, just as we have. As we watch, I marvel at the fact that they know which path to follow. How do they find their way over oceans and glaciers, across continents and mountain ranges, without the benefit of a map, compass, or GPS? For many years, we've known that birds use the sun as a compass. At first glance, this concept seems simple. Even the most directionally challenged among us understand that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. But in practice, like most things in nature, it requires more than a basic heuristic. Decades of research has taught us that birds use a diverse suite of tools to find their way, orienting by stars or wind, responding to signals from magnetic or olfactory receptors. In many cases, though, when it comes to explaining how birds navigate from one place to another, the truth is that we simply still don't know. Here among the ice and snow lies the magic that is hard to capture through textbooks or journal articles or the blue screen of my computer. For individual birds, there is nothing formulaic about migration. Each season is different, every journey unique. Birds must learn to follow the fickle pulses of the jet stream, to negotiate snowy mountain passes, to skirt the ferocity of spring storms. E7, the bird whose satellite track revealed an impressive 7,396-mile nonstop flight, didn't attain fame because she did anything particularly unique for a bar-tailed godwit, but because she showed us how remarkable the usual can be. To get to their breeding grounds, birds chance everything in an ordinary act that is by any measure extraordinary. And so it was at these kinds of moments where I felt like my experiences as a biologist, my experiences as a traveler, and just the challenges of the landscape all kind of coalesced to really appreciate the wonders of something as not simple as migration, but as we take for granted, And I'm sure many of you who've been Inland Canal and explored some of its margins, you know, familiar with the Katsahine, and just to sort of recognize that as such a prime migratory pathway for birds was really cool to see, you know, birds on one side and then to sort of hopscotch along and actually follow them up and over into Tagish Lake and Marsh Lake, and in some species cases all the way up to the Arctic, really added an element for me that was pretty remarkable. And so, as I mentioned, as we got up and over into the Yukon, we then paddled along Tagish Marsh Lakes and got out of the headwaters of the Yukon. And we did this by pack raft, but then we got to Whitehorse and had the opportunity to pick up a very inexpensive rental canoe and suddenly have the luxury of paddling downriver and to take all of the things that we wanted. So boxes of cookies and, you know, big bags of rolls and boxed wine and all the luxuries that aren't really possible when you're carrying everything on your back. So this is kind of a mini vacation. And one of the big elements of it that made it especially luxurious was the fact that all the navigational pieces more or less went away. We had to, you know, work our way through the current, but in terms of knowing where we needed to go and trying to make those micro decisions kind of every minute, really, which is what we were doing on much of the landscape, the river dictated the direction. And then we got to Dawson City, where we left the canoe, and this was the first big leg of the trip where we were hiking. And it turned out to be a little bit rough on the feet to go from wearing ski boots or rubber boots to suddenly, you know, pounding out the miles in these kind of lightweight hiking shoes. And it was also a time of year where in the mountains, there was still a lot of snow, but down low, things were starting to leaf out. So it's kind of a balance between bushwhacking and post-holing. Sometimes we found the correct balance, and often we didn't. But we made our way up north and into the headwaters of the Wind and the Peel rivers, which are not what's pictured here. I'm sort of jumping forward to the Mackenzie Delta, which was extremely memorable for reasons that I hope not to repeat. As you can see here, there's just this incredible sort of maze of channels and lots and lots of wetlands, which make it an amazing place for waterfowl. So ducks are happy here. Turns out two little people in pack rafts were less happy. The mosquitoes were unlike anything I've ever seen. And I grew up in Alaska and have spent most of my sort of field work days in the north. But this was a whole nother level. And so as we made our way up and out of the Mackenzie Delta, it was an enormous relief when we finally arrived to the Arctic coast, the Arctic Ocean, not just because of these incredibly stunning views, but because it meant that we could finally see again and take off our head nets and enjoy some of the benefits of having the onshore breeze and keep the mosquitoes at bay. And then, as I mentioned, we traveled along the coast of the Arctic Ocean until we reached Kaktovik and kind of the gateway to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so here we took a sharp turn to the south to get more or less onto the crest of the Brooks Range. And as we were traveling, this was one of the really common features that we saw that actually ended up making travel through the Arctic possible. Without these, we would have, I think, floundered and perhaps made it a portion of the distance, but this was really critical for route finding. And I know you all don't have your mics on right now, but if you did, I would ask you what these are. And some of you probably have seen them for yourselves, but for those of you who haven't, these are the trails of caribou. And so, you know, you're looking at, I'll talk about this a little bit more in the second half of the presentation, but, you know, you're looking at these really large scale maps and trying to dream up a trip or a route or a way to get from one place to another. It's often almost impossible to make sense of what the landscape looks like, you know, relative to what the map is telling you. And of course, now with satellite and other technology, we have a greater ability to sort of piece those things together in advance. But nonetheless, there's only so much that you can see from above versus actually being on the landscape. And so time and time again, you know, we would think, oh, we really intended to go this way, but the caribou tracks are going this other way. And on the occasions when we decided that maybe we knew better than the caribou, we were very quickly schooled otherwise. Often, if we didn't follow them, we would end up kind of at the edge of this, raging torrent of water, or at the edge of a cliff, or wallowing the bushes. And so caribou have been pounding out these routes for thousands of years, and they certainly know their way across this landscape. And so that was kind of another nice connection between the way that we moved and the animals and the wildlife on the landscape, just understanding that we were very reliant on them for making our way. And by the time we got to the Brooks Range, I'm moving through these kind of quickly because I wanted to save a little bit of time for talking about kind of what's happened since this trip, which is now about almost 10 years ago, or close to 10 years ago. But we got to the Brooks Range, and so when we dreamed up this adventure to begin with, it was a little audacious, and we knew that. And so as we would think about it and talk about it, we kept having in the backs of our minds, like, okay, we might not make it all the way to the end, so we'll set out to go as far as we can. And we were pushing up against winter on both ends. So we started the Inside Passage in March, which was, as you all know, a very stormy time of year. But then on the other end, we would be pushing up against winter in the Arctic. So hoping to end sometime in September, even that was, bordering on being too late for a lot of these areas to be able to travel without fully transitioning to winter gear. But the fact that we had made it all the way to the Brooks Range was in some ways really empowering, and kind of gave us this combined sense of being really large on the landscape and also very, very tiny. So it's the kind of place that will make you feel just like a little speck in the world. And that can be, a really moving experience. But at the same time, the fact that we managed to get that far without any major disasters and kind of kept up our pace, and we really were on track for finishing up with this traverse of the Brooks Range, which was one of the places we'd always wanted to travel and we're really excited about. So there's a little bit of, I don't want to say ego, but maybe a little bit of overconfidence at this point. And as the land is excellent at doing, it very quickly reminded us of our place in the world. Because soon after that, we ran into kind of a series of problems. The first was that it started to rain and rain and rain. And this not only made the landscape incredibly flooded and really difficult to travel on when we were down low, and in the river valleys, all the crossings were made much more difficult. But then up in the mountains, we had a number of passes to go over, and we were starting to run into a lot of snow. And we're at this point still in, little hiking shoes, and we can see we have pack rafts and trekking poles, but not proper winter gear. And so there were a number of places where we got turned around and had to find a different route. We also had a very scary encounter with a predatory bear. This was in the Brooks Range in Gates of the Arctic National Park. And this particular bear is a black bear, kind of a lighter colored black bear. We'd seen several other bears in that day, and we're certainly, aware of making lots of noise and traveling mindfully. And we were just coming out of this really brushy section into kind of a clearing, and I heard something rustling behind me, and I turned around thinking that, oh, maybe I'd see a jay or a bird. And instead I see this bear just staring at me, and it had pretty obviously been stalking us. And almost immediately, I knew this was not like any other bear I had ever met. And over the course of about the next 30 minutes, it kind of turned into this protracted standoff where the bear kept circling around and approaching us to within just a few feet. And the fact that it was interested in something other than, defense or any food that we might be carrying was almost immediately apparent. And so we ended up fighting back with our trekking poles, yelling at it, turning into really kind of defensive mode. We even sprayed with bear spray at one point. Unfortunately, everything was so slow moving, including the bear at that point, that it saw this pepper cloud and ducked its head out of the way and was able to avoid it. But it was definitely a pretty scary experience after having lived in bear country for most of the previous 5 months. Suddenly we felt really unsettled, camping, sleeping in a tent every night and just being out in the bears' homes. So this was kind of a moment where it felt like things were starting to unravel a little bit, and all of the confidence and hope that we'd had that the trip, might end in a way that we had imagined, was starting to come apart. And then the next problem we ran into was food. So this was the one place on the whole trip where we had air support, and we had planned a resupply at the headwaters of the Noatak River. And the reason that we did that there is because there really weren't any communities that would allow us to resupply through a town or a post office. And so, we thought, okay, we have this one resupply. We were going to be getting a bunch more food, some warmer clothes, a proper stove, because up to this point we'd been just cooking with open fire. And that was turning out to be really difficult in the recent days and weeks when it had been so wet. And then we were also going to be picking up a foldable canoe to make the last section on the Noatak hopefully safer and more efficient. We'd spent a lot of time on the Mackenzie River in pack rafts, and a big wide river with a headwind is not a very fun place to be paddling a little rubber ducky type boat. But the stormy weather that persisted, I think it was some of the most intense flooding that area had seen in quite a lot of years, just continued. And so the plane wasn't able to get to us, and we ended up being stretched thin on food because our previous leg had taken longer as we were diverted by the snow in the flooded rivers. So we had to cover a lot more miles than we'd originally planned. So we were already stretched quite thin. And then as we were waiting for a resupply, we ended up going several days with no food at all. And it was a very humbling experience to recognize how dependent we were on this sort of outside source after having spent so many weeks and months just needing to get ourselves to the next resupply point. But fortunately, that I'm here and things turned out okay. We did eventually get our resupply. I think we ate more in the first hour than we had in the previous week. But with it came this folding canoe. And so we were ready to set out down the river again. And within, I don't know, the first half a day or so, it became kind of serendipitous that we'd had this long delay because we ended up crossing paths with the Western Arctic caribou herd on their fall migration, which ended up being one of the most incredible sightings or experiences on this trip, and for me in my lifetime. And I'll read a little section about that experience. So I should just preface this by saying that we'd been paddling down, and I saw what looked like an antler, or excuse me, a branch floating on the water, and it turned out it was an antler. And so we pulled to the side of the river to watch as we noticed a few caribou crossing. And then I'll read about what follows. After the last of the animals has crossed, we haul the canoe higher up the bank and walk over to the flurry of tracks they have left in the sand. A narrow trail leads into the bushes, and we hike up to investigate. The air is thick with the musty smell of caribou where hair and scat plaster the ground. We began to hazard guesses at the number of animals that we'd seen. 50, 100, more? And then as we stare down at the tiny tracks of a calf, a wave of sound approaches like a squall across the water. Soon we hear brush crackling, and the wave becomes a tsunami. Quick, get down, I say, and we duck into a stand of willows. Within seconds, we're surrounded by caribou. The tendons in their legs click audibly, and their breaths come in snorts and throaty huffs. In single file, they march in front of us. So close, I'm tempted to graze their flanks with my fingertips. Instead, I close my eyes and feel the steam rising from their bodies. Mostly, the caribou ignore us. But as they pass, some glance sideways in surprise, the flashing whites of their eyes sharp against deep brown irises. One large bull steps gingerly over Pat's outstretched legs. A curious calf sniffs us, its face mere inches from ours. Limbs frozen in place, Pat and I communicate with raised eyebrows and whispers. It's suddenly clear to me that the hungry wait, the rain and snow, and the fact that the pilot took days to reach us happened so that we could witness this migration. For months, we've traveled in the shadow of caribou. First the porcupine herd, then the central and western Arctic herds. Their rutted tracks, extending like veins across the landscape, guided us over the foothills and peaks of the Brooks Range, across hundreds of miles of Arctic vastness. Again and again, they led us away from steep cliffs and treacherous slopes, through terrain that seemed impenetrable. We learned to trust their wisdom over our own, to follow hoofprints as they traced an ancient route across the tundra. Now we are here with them. For all of its seeming cruelties and callousness, the land has given us what we need most: closure, completeness. We never could have guessed that this glorious moment would be the culmination of our hardships. So with that, I'm gonna kind of wrap up maybe the sun as a compass and that trip, and launch into a few other kind of thoughts and ideas about adventure more generally, and then where that's taken us since. But I don't know if we want to pause for just a moment and see if anyone has questions about this first part of the presentation. I don't know if that would work now, Brandon. Okay, I see a thumbs up. And I actually can't see the chat with the way my screen is working. So if there are questions in the chat, if somebody could read them out to me, that'd be great. And if not, we can just kind of move forward and come back around. Yeah, go ahead, whoever. Alan, Crystal.
Hey, I'm a medical person. I was just wondering what kind of medical issues like foot problems, knee problems, etc., did you experience during your adventure?
Good question. Hi, Al. I've really enjoyed listening to you on the radio over the years. We were very fortunate. We did not have any major problems. The biggest things that we dealt with were things like blisters. And that was especially pronounced when I mentioned we transitioned from kind of being in these hard boots or neoprene boots to a lot of miles in hiking shoes. And so just trying to keep those feet clean and, blisters dealt with as best as possible. We, at the time, actually, I feel like I've learned a lot of things since, but this tape called Leukotape is kind of an amazing medical tape that is really useful for blisters. I think we were using duct tape and a variety of other things at the time, but that was one of the biggest medical problems, really. I did end up, self-diagnosed, but I've had Giardia before. So we had carried with us Giardia meds, and I recognized the symptoms at one point. We just more or less drank the water untreated, except when we were relatively near communities. And for the most part, we were lucky with that, except the one time, but I knew how to treat that. And we did have a pretty complete med kit with us. But yeah, like you mentioned, a lot of those overuse injuries are almost the most likely to take you out. I had a little bit of elbow tendonitis that to some degree you just have to kind of grin and bear it when you have another, couple hundred miles or whatever to paddle. And so there was some of that going on, but we were fortunate not to have any serious accidents. One point, Pat flipped his raft in the Arctic Ocean. So that could have been bad news, but we were able to get to shore and get him warm pretty quickly. So yeah, lots of potential for accidents, but in some ways, this type of traverse trip is, it's kind of the length of exposure as opposed to the really acute hazards. We've done a lot of climbing and ski a lot and other things where sometimes those, more immediate objective hazards can be a bigger threat. In this case, it was just that kind of constant exposure for more or less 6 months. Great question.
So there's two questions in the chat. This is Cindy
Okay.
here reading them. One is, what electronics did you carry? And then the other is, was there anything that you took that you didn't need?
Oh yeah. Good question. To answer the first one, electronics, again, I would do it differently now. I'm not the most tech savvy person, as you probably have gathered. And there was quite a bit available at the time, but we just had paper maps. We did not have any electronic mapping other than a handheld GPS that was just like a lat long. It was like a little really mini Garmin, didn't have a mapping component to it. So we were pretty low tech in that regard, map and compass for a lot of it. And then we did have like imagery of some of the places where we knew that we might run into troubles, like part of the Brooks Range. So we took satellite photos from Google Earth. But as far as navigation, now there's a million different options. And even then those were available, but just wasn't something we were in the habit of using. We did carry an iPhone. I think probably the first iteration of an iPhone that we had, but that was largely for different references. And so when we came to communities, we had access to Wi-Fi. We could use the phone for things. And I actually, like, as a writer, one of the things that arguably was not necessary, but I really liked having, was this little tiny roll-up keyboard that I think weighed, I want to say 2 ounces. It was very, very light. And it allowed me to journal. I'm a really slow handwriter. So as much as I like the romantic idea of, journaling in a physical notebook, and I do some of that, but to really get ideas down quickly, I'm just so much faster at typing. So I could use that and pair it to the phone and then, send it off by email or whatever as backups whenever we went through a community, which was about every 10 days to 2 weeks. So that was another piece of technology. We carried a satellite phone, which I think now I would just bring an inReach, but in some ways trying to coordinate logistics in remote areas can be quite challenging texting unless you have a sort of land-based person who can then coordinate, because as probably a lot of you try to call a pilot in a small town, they may or may not have access to a cell phone. It might just be a landline. And then a big part of it too was just being able to check in with my parents. So being able to hear somebody's voice, I think, goes a long way in knowing that they really are okay. And so I would call and check in with my family, and that gave a lot of peace of mind, I think, for the folks back at home. So I think those were the main forms of technology. We had a little solar charger that we could use to charge electronics, and a camera, like a handheld sort of fancier point and shoot. And yeah, so I guess as far as things we didn't need, there was not much that I would have done without. I could have done without my keyboard. I ended up losing different letters along the way, and you don't appreciate how much you need a, whatever, S or a Z or something until you don't have access to it. But I got good at substituting little Morse code in there instead of the letter that I had intended. And gosh, other things, we were pretty bare bones. I think we wore all the layers that we carried most days, and we didn't have, our feet were wet, I think, every day. And we just had these lightweight hiking shoes, in part because we knew they would dry out quickly. And for so much of the Arctic, there is no avoiding the wet with tussocks and permafrost. It's just wet. So having the ability to dry them out at night was really helpful. But yeah, I'll come back to the question if I think of anything else that we were carrying that we didn't need.
Somebody else asks, will you touch on your experience with the stalking moose?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so up on the Arctic coast. So for those of you who've been up on that coastline, how sort of otherworldly it can be. And I have some photos, but I don't have them in this presentation, I don't think. But so we came out, we finally got to the out of the Mackenzie Delta, which was incredibly trying, probably the only time on the whole trip that we really considered quitting. And it was not the hardest. It wasn't the scariest by any means. It wasn't even, physically the most trying, but just the sheer misery of it was kind of it was one of those things where I started to question, why am I doing this? This seems like a really bad idea. So by the time we got to the Arctic coast, we were really excited to be there, and then to be seeing, all these amazing animals and birds, and just feeling like our eyes had been opened. And of course, there's no day or night. It's just all light all the time. And it's really hard to get a sense of perspective. So you look out on the horizon and you might see a gull and think it's, the size of a small truck, or vice versa. And this was the case when I think it was midnight or 1 a.m. or something. We're paddling and noticed these two shapes out in the distance. And as they kind of start approaching us and we're paddling, but slowly, we'd noticed that, or we realized that they're moose, and there's these two moose in the Arctic Ocean. And that was already surprising to see, moose in saltwater, and then to see moose in Arctic saltwater. And then to have them be waiting, because that's the other bizarre thing about the Arctic Ocean as compared to, the Pacific and most coastlines that probably a lot of us are familiar with, is that it can be shallow for miles offshore. And really what drives the water level is the onshore wind. And so it can, change by several feet, but it's not going to be dictated at all by tides. It's like a matter of a couple of inches. So got these really, really shallow, extensive offshore areas. And so these moose are walking and we're paddling, and, we're making time, but not great time in our pack rafts. And it's so shallow that our paddles are kind of hitting the bottom. And meanwhile, these moose just keep following us, and they're pretty quickly gaining on us. And so I don't know if I would call them stalking moose, but they were definitely curious moose, and they ended up following us for quite a long time. I mean, it was really intimidating. Moose are kind of strange creatures to begin with. You often don't know what they're thinking, if anything. But these moose, I don't know. Yeah, I still don't know what they were hoping to get from us, except maybe we were as strange to them as they were to us. But in the end, we were able to kind of outpace them and get away. But it was rather intimidating.
And then I have a question. Your packs look quite big and heavy. What do you think your average weight was in when you were in the Brooks Range?
It varied so much. It was really probably our heaviest was going up and over the Coast Mountains by Sinclair there, because we had skis on our backs and we had pack rafts and we had almost, it wasn't quite 2 weeks of food, but 10 days of food. So I think that was our max. And I don't know, maybe my pack was 65 pounds ish, 70 pounds. It felt heavy. But the majority of the time we were quite a bit lighter, other than when we picked up a resupply. So we would be really heavy and then we kind of eat our way through the weight. But for much of it, we were traveling, with a super lightweight tent, no stove, because we were just using open fire to cook, and minimal clothing, pretty light sleeping bags. And so when we were for the sections we didn't have rafts, there was one place where we mailed the rafts to ourselves. I should have explained that at the beginning. Why were we swimming rather than pack rafting? That was a section where it allowed us to travel a lot faster. And we had a section besides that one big river crossing that was going to be kind of all following these ridges. And so we mailed our packs from Arctic Village to Anaktuvik Pass, or our rafts. And so in that section, toward the end of it, we were really light because we did not have much food and we didn't have rafts and just really lightweight backpacking gear. So I would say it fluctuated wildly, at the minimum, maybe 30 pounds, 25 or 30 pounds. I should probably know, because I know we went to great lengths to weigh everything and decide what was going to be the lightest, most efficient option.
And there's another, thank you for your answers. I can't imagine carrying a 65-pound pack anymore. And a question from Kathleen Menke is, could you remind us about the boreal chickadee experience?
Oh yeah, so the gray-headed chickadee, yeah, sure. So so that first section that I read about crossing the river, when we landed on the other side, it was probably the time that I was most scared for having the potential to lose my partner. And Pat was really struggling with the swimming section, I think because his jacket had filled up with water, and just the way that it was weighing him down. I was trying to figure out if I should go in after him or what to do. And he obviously made it to the other side, but it was a really terrifying experience, and kind of one of those things where you're like, why are we doing this? This seems like a terrible idea. But when we land on the other side, I heard this, my ears are very tuned to chickadees because I've studied them for quite a few years. And they all have slightly different voices, chestnut-backed or black-capped or boreal. And So I heard something that sounded familiar, but not quite right. And it turned out that it was a gray-headed chickadee. And then it turned out there was a whole family of gray-headed chickadees. And, they really have not been sighted in that region for the last close to a decade. There've been a lot of efforts put into trying to figure out, where they've gone, if they're still around. And so the fact that, I got to see them and that they showed up at such an opportune time after that big crossing made it extra special.
Thanks. I guess that's all the questions in the chat.
Okay.
Maybe you'd like to finish with the rest of what you have planned, and then.
Oh yeah, I didn't realize what time it was either. Well,
You can go longer. It's not, there's no magic thing about 8 o'clock, but.
Okay. Well, if anyone needs to leave, I fully understand, but I'll just talk a little bit about kind of this idea of like the makings of an adventure and some of the things that I've thought about over the years and since that trip, and particularly with having young children. My kids I have 2 boys who are now 6 and 8. And so of course we've come up with some different ways to go about getting out in the wilds and having adventures. And that's changed a lot over the years. So I guess maybe just a few sort of lessons learned. So practice, or this is how we've done it anyway, do it on a small scale first. So when we were prepping and planning for that big trip, there were a variety of things that we needed to learn, like how to pack raft in whitewater, and even like straight up backpacking. We'd done very little of. We'd done a lot of climbing and mountaineering and things, but just figuring out how to travel fast and light, that was kind of something that we worked towards. So we did a variety of smaller-ish trips to kind of help us prepare and get some of those skills. Fit the landscape. I definitely believe in that you can push really hard against something, but usually simple is better, and something that matches the area that you're traveling through, that it suits it best. Plan your resupplies so you don't look like this. This was coming out of the Mendenhall Towers even earlier than this last trip I talked about. And I don't remember how much weight we had, but it was totally ridiculous and we could barely walk. And this was part of why the idea of a long traverse was really appealing, because we didn't have climbing gear and all this other extremely heavy equipment that meant that moving was cumbersome and slow. But if you can figure out resupplies and do it in a way that prevents you from having to carry, I don't know what these were, 80 to 100 pound packs, that is certainly preferable. Push your limits, but kind of have your safe out. So there's different ways to kind of hang it out there, but then be always thinking, if this doesn't work out, what are my alternatives? Is there another way down? Like in this case, as I'd mentioned, we had one route planned up and over the mountains from Lynn Canal, and realized quickly that wasn't going to be the safe choice. And so we had to reroute. It took us longer, was kind of challenging with the ice conditions, but we knew that being in steep terrain when it was really avalanche prone was a bad idea. And ultimately expect to be surprised. That's maybe the one rule of thumb for adventure, that it won't go according to plan, no matter how well you plan. This was the pass coming down into the Aragetch, into the Noatak Valley. And this was like our last big descent into what we thought was then going to be cruisy, although we weren't anticipating running out of food and waiting so long for a resupply. But this talus field covered in snow, that wasn't really on our list of potential hazards to be thinking about, but it took hours to pick our way down this frozen slope. And make it your own. So I think, sometimes there's a tendency, especially now with so much access to seeing all the other cool things that people are doing, to feel like you're, I don't want to say competing, but maybe the trip isn't as ambitious, or it's not as cool, or it's not this or that. But you can always make it your own and make it interesting. And this is, I didn't talk about this in the last section, but this was a real formative trip that my husband Pat and I, we weren't married at the time, but this was like the first adventure we did together. Was in the summer of 2002. And we decided that we would hike into the headwaters of the Wind River and build a birch bark canoe. And, we were young and very naive, and a lot of things that we didn't know, but we were certainly excited about this prospect. And so I won't get into all the details except to say that there was a lot of things that didn't work out as we had planned. For one, there were no birch trees in that valley. I'd sort of done my homework. I looked at all the vegetation maps of northern Canada and showed lots of birch trees, but maybe had we asked the right people, we would have known that that was not in fact the case. So we ended up building out a spruce bark, definitely an inferior material, but it did work. We ran out of food, seems to be a common theme, but I had packed thinking, okay, 2,000 calories per person per day, like that's the recommended amount. So I, very carefully counted all of those, but turns out the 2,000 calories is completely inadequate when you're moving your body a lot. And so we were very hungry and at times feeling kind of desperate. But in the end, we did manage to pull this trip off and float a couple of 100 miles north to Fort McPherson. And it was about a 60-day trip. And at the time, we didn't have any like satellite communication or anything. So we were really out there. But that was probably the first thing that really cemented our relationship. And it was the kind of thing was either going to break it or make it. And for whatever reason, this clicked for us. And after that time, we decided that we wanted to do another big thing at some point in the future. But I guess this is just an example of kind of the way you can be creative about the types of adventures you take. And I'm not advocating that anybody go out and build a bark canoe, but there's lots of, iterations of adventuring. And I think, sometimes not having the comparison of what other people have done gives you a lot more freedom to just explore and make it your own adventure. So kind of shifting gears to reimagining adventure and what that's looked like for us. So backcountry travel with kids is of course a little bit of a different animal than backcountry travel as adults. And this is our son Huxley. When he was 10 weeks old, we did a trip on the Lost Coast with him, and you can see he's kind of found his happy place there in the pack raft. But there's that question of like, what's possible? You maybe come to your own limits and start to know what you're capable of without children, but then, how does that translate to having a family? And that's been a question that we kind of ask again and again in different forms, depending on the kids' ages. Here we are again. This is the Lost Coast. And this ironically was probably one of the happiest times of like real early infancy for me as a new mom. There was lots of challenges and lots of good things too, but Huxley had some food allergies that we weren't aware of, and so he was pretty uncomfortable and was crying a lot. And we happened not to have certain foods on this trip just because we hadn't had a chance to go to town before we set out, and so we had limited stuff for resupplies. And I think that dietary shift was just enough to make him more comfortable, and in turn make us more comfortable. So although we were kind of out in this pretty wild place, and by some people's standards maybe not a place to take a baby, it was actually one of my fondest memories of being a new young family, was being out in this amazing landscape and just kind of all being happy. Let's see, I actually can't read that, so I'm gonna whatever it says there, but this idea of like sort of adjusting as you go along with kids, safety.
It said what gear to bring. That's what it said.
Oh, thank you. What gear to bring? Okay,
and and then the next one says safety.
Okay, I could read that one. Yeah, my for some reason I can't use my mouse when I'm in the screen share mode. But so, what gear do you bring? That's obviously an essential question, and that is something that they don't necessarily make a lot of wonderful backcountry gear for babies. But trying to figure out like, how do you sleep with a baby in a tent? How do you keep them dry and warm and all of those different things? So those are some elements that we've kind of thought through and learned from others, and hopefully shared a little bit of what we know. Safety is obviously, an even more acute consideration when you have little people depending on you. and, what your sort of threshold is. And, Al mentioned earlier, the medical component. So trying to figure out like what's a really robust med kit for a young child and not just for an adult. Even things like, as breastfeeding at the time, always carrying a supply of formula, just on the off chance that something happened to me and you wouldn't end up with also a baby with nothing to eat. Travel with little ones is exhausting, usually worth it. Allows you to sort of have all the wonder and the amazement all over again from, a different perspective. Here we are, this is up in Haynes Pass area when the kids were, I think, 2 and 4 there. But at some point we were starting to get very, very heavy. So we were carrying them until we just couldn't anymore. And so having to get a little bit more creative with other ways to travel. So these new ages and stages, try bikes, try rowboats, try rafts. This is a picture in the back of Drake's plane. I can't remember where we were going. I think we're going to Glacier Point in the winter. Yeah, just lots of trying, and there's probably no perfect solution at any particular moment, but that, as the kids grow, you can kind of adapt your strategies and your modes of transportation. This was a trip we took to New Zealand, where we were trekking, and we were very heavy, probably as heavy as we were going over the coast mountains, just because we had baby and lots of gear, and then a 4-year-old who could walk some of the time. This was, we ended up buying this little tiny van and kind of cohabitating in the van, which at times was wonderful and other times looked a little like this. This is Dawson, our younger one, when we were in New Zealand. Sometimes you feel successful and everything's wonderful, and sometimes not so much. So one of the things that we've taken up in the last few years is sailing. So Pat and I did some sailing previously when we were living in Bellingham, when he was finishing college and I was doing a master's program. But we hadn't done a lot of sailing in the interim, but with kids, it suddenly made a lot more sense again, because it allowed us kind of a floating home base that allowed us to get to some really amazing places without having to haul everything on our backs or drag them behind us. This is where we started, and this was down in Washington. We brought our first boat up the Inside Passage, and Dawson, the younger one, was about 20 months, and we first got him on the boat and we're wondering what we could possibly do with a little guy who couldn't even really sit up properly in his life jacket. Do you put him in a helmet? Do you put him in a harness? What do you do with him? And then that's Huxley, the older one there on the left, who was turning 4 at the time. But a boat has allowed us to get to some amazing places. This is in Glacier Bay with friends from Haynes. So probably many of you know Sika, and Chaika was our boat. And then just kind of figuring out, as you try these different things, like what rules are immutable. So like life jackets, for example, that is never ever a question. And for many of you who've raised children, you probably know all these things already. But I guess just emphasizing some of these points that we've learned along the way, that, you kind of set your line in the sand, and certain things you just don't compromise on. Because I often will hear that from other parents, like, oh, well, how do you get them to do this or do that or the other thing? And it just isn't an option. You just simply do it from the beginning. Sometimes there's natural consequences with pretty predictable outcomes. So, if you are using a knife, you wear leather gloves, but if you don't and you get a cut, then it's obvious what will happen. So I think the kids learn really quickly how to be safe, and you of course can't trust a 2-year-old to make good choices on a boat, but they are more capable, I think, than we often give them credit for. But they have to kind of understand what the consequences are, not by getting them into trouble, but just they're not doing it because mom and dad said so, but because it's the safe thing, and these are the reasons why. Almost always more kids equals more fun. So this is with Graham and Lindsay and Mira in Glacier Bay, and the kids all playing in the snow and having a good time. But I think the more that there's company possible, the more fun it is for everybody. for Pat and I, we definitely take turns. So one of us will get out on an adventure and the other one, it's much harder to do it together. It's getting a little bit easier as the kids get older, but sort of that rule of go when you get the chance, whether the weather's right or not, or whatever else, just to get out there. It's almost always worth it. Thank goodness for grandparents. There's times when we've been able to get out in the mountains together, only due to the grace of our parents making that possible. And then another piece that we've done a lot of is this sort of living wild and having micro adventures. So we've been really fortunate to spend a lot of time at Glacier Point and be based on a sailboat. And so just by the fact of being out there, you'll see amazing things and get to experience these sort of micro adventures, even if it's not on the scale of thousands of miles. It can just be half a mile from home, but still getting to see a lot of the things that you might see just by being out. I think for our kids, it's been really critical that they feel like they're part of the team. I mean, if you ask them now with sailing, they think they're just as important of crew as we are. And I think that sort of mentality is important to encourage because it does make them feel not just like they're stuck with our plan, but they're, active partners in it. And, if you're lucky, you can find a place you want to be. And for those of you tuning in from Haines, it's probably largely why you're there. Such an amazing place. And so having, the backyards we're fortunate to get to explore certainly makes adventure possible on a daily basis. It's all about scale with kids that, spending 2 hours combing along a tiny stretch of beach might have felt like more of a waste of time had I not had the benefit of, seeing everything through these little people's eyes, because they notice things that we often are too busy or too much in a hurry to see. And that everything changes. That's kind of the rule of parenting, right? That just when you think you figured out one thing, it's going to be a different challenge or a different issue. So I'll end with that. I'm sorry we went over a little bit, but happy to answer questions. I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of a sense of like how we think about adventure and how we've approached that now with kids, since the trip that's featured in the Sun as a Compass is a little while ago, and some of the things that are evolving. I will just put a little plug in. I don't have a picture here, but our next big plan is hopefully sailing to the Canadian or the Eastern Arctic, up to, if we're lucky, Greenland and Baffin Island and Eastern Canada. So that's the plan, launching into this next fall and the winter and spring. So yeah, I would be happy to answer questions, or if folks need to go, I totally understand too.
Are you gonna, this is Cindy, are you gonna sail from here?
Good question. No, we actually sold, we sold our, hopefully we'll sail back here eventually. We sold our, the boat that we had for a number of years that was based out of Haines, Chika. It was a 32-foot west sail, and we ended up buying a boat in Europe that is a little bit more Arctic suitable. So an aluminum hulled, very well insulated. It's a 43-foot with a lifting keel, so a lifting centerboard, so you can go really shallow. And so the plan is it's in Greece right now. We're going to head back over in the early fall, and then start making our way around and up north to Norway and beyond if things go sort of according to plan, which maybe not, but we'll get somewhere.
That sounds fabulous. Very lucky kids.
Yeah, and we'd like to make our way back here, but the route still to be determined.
People can unmute themselves if they have questions, or you can type them into the chat.
Yeah, if anybody wants to share how they go about sort of adapting adventure to having families, I'm always really curious about that.
My family was never as adventurous as yours, but we would often go to New Zealand where, it's hard to go backpacking with very young kids, as you obviously know, and you're stronger than we were, but there's places in New Zealand where you can go backpacking. You send your pack on a boat, like able Tasman. And so that's what we would do. Put the pack on a boat, and we'd hike with the kids and carry them and let them walk. And then we'd get there and our pack would be sitting on the beach.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah. Yeah, we did a little bit of the hut trekking in New Zealand also, and we were definitely the slowest and the heaviest. And I know when we get into the next hut, we'd have like people clapping because we made it. Tempting the kids with gummy bears, but a boat sounds like a much smarter idea.
Well, I'm pretty sure that all this great information you have about kids will be very welcome. There's quite a few people here in town with young kids, and it is so much harder. And so it's inspiring what you've done, and maybe encourage a bunch of us to get out there a little bit more.
Love it.
One of the things that I really appreciated about in reading your book was the adventure part was great and that was fun, but I loved how we were reading along and all of a sudden we're learning about birds in different places. You did a beautiful job of incorporating that in and making it really interesting and real for with the adventure. And I really appreciated the combination of that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, you know, and I didn't talk about the writing process much, which I'm also happy to answer questions about. But, you know, the birds were really, when I found the birds again in the story, that's when I kind of felt like I found my voice, that it was, I started off writing like a scientist, and then I took too much of the science out. And then when I realized that the birds were showing me what I needed to do, yeah, I think that helped me bring the story together. But thank you for that.
So it looks like we got a couple of things in the chat. Kathleen Menke says, thank you, loved your book and great presentation.
Thanks a lot.
Not a question, but take it as you will. Alan Clark says, sounds like another great adventure. Please keep us posted. Will you bring that boat through the Northwest Passage?
To be determined. Yeah, we're gonna get up north first and then figure out what we're doing from there.
And then Michelle W says, do you think you'll write a book about your next sailing adventure?
I would like to, and I'd actually like to write more about Glacier Point and Southeast, and yeah, places that are kind of near and dear to my heart. So yeah, stay tuned. The writing with kids is kind of similar to adventuring with kids. There's a few compromises to be made. So yeah, still slowly picking away at these different projects, but thanks.
Any other questions out there?
Couple more in the chat. Pardon me if I butcher this, John. John Norton says, my experience in the Arrogech Peaks had a hunger issue. We caught grayling. Were you able to catch fish?
Good question. Short answer, no. So where we were based, waiting kind of once we got out of the main NOAA, everything was so flooded that the water was extremely silty. And so fishing was not really happening for that reason in part. And then also where we were was kind of on the slough, and there weren't any fish available for us to catch. And, you know, we weren't set up for, we'd done a little bit of fishing along the way, but in general, we were spending most of our time moving as opposed to trying to harvest, which, as you all know, takes a fair bit of time. But no, we tried, but did not catch anything.
And then Alan Clark has another question. Will you homeschool the kids?
Yeah, hopefully with some support.
And anyone else?
Well, I'll say for myself, thank you very much. This was so inspiring. It's made me more excited to get back out there in the wilderness and adventure more instead of just doing the easy things that I tend to do. So thank you. They're beautiful pictures. And again, I just love your book. I love how you share the personal stuff, as well as the logistics and everything else. And then I'd also say one part of the book that I found really amazing is, I live here, I kayak, but I just can't imagine going across Lynn Canal in a pack raft. I haven't been in a pack raft that often, but it just seems like you can't go in a straight line, and the wind is really impacts you a lot. So that part really impressed me.
Yeah, I definitely have to pick your weather window, and not the most efficient means of travel. I'm always impressed by how stable they really are, though, and chop they do pretty well. But yeah, I can think of other better ways to cross Lynn Canal if given the choice. But yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for letting me kind of do a little diversion. It's slightly different, not just a straight book talk. So yeah, it's fun to get to share with folks, and hopefully I'll see many of you in and around Haines or out at Glacier Point, and I'd love to continue the conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Carolyn. Really appreciate a couple of last comments here in the chat. As you're heading out the door, Julie Korsmeyer says, thank you, loved your book also. Alan Clark says, thank you, you brought back some good memories. Megan Miller says, thanks so much for your wonderful talk. I'm inspired to get my toddler out in the wilderness. We'll start with camping.
Perfect.
Brown says, thanks very much. And Gina says, thank you for sharing. It was very inspiring. I enjoyed that. Like I said, I got a 2 and a 10-month-old, and right now our expeditions go to about the end of the street past Cindy's house, but we'll build it up to it. So absolutely fantastic presentation. Thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for helping to end our Armchair Traveler presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, you're in the thick of it. 10 months and 2.
It gets easier, right?
Oh,
It gets
absolutely.
easier.
That is true. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again. Good night, everyone.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Everyone have a
good
great
evening,
night.
everybody.